you a message that the recording is in process. All right, so thank you again. Couple of housekeeping. You can expand your audio if you at any point have trouble hearing us, then please go ahead and click the button right next to your should show mute. You'll click right next to that and you can either call in or switch to computer audio, whichever is going to be most helpful for you. You can disable your video if you would like to be on video. We'd love to see your faces. So please know that you have that option. For participants, if you're trying to figure out who all's in the room, you can click on the participants, and if you see somebody you know, you can always private message. You can also private message myself. I am Miranda Stiers. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the prevention program specialist with a partnership. And I'm going to allow Marcella to introduce herself as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcella Maggio, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am joining everyone from CommUNITY land, known as San Diego today, and I am the preventionist and storyteller for the partnership. So happy y'all are here.
And I am joining from Nissan on Land in Sacramento. You can private message us if you have any questions. Also, if you have any suggestions. So today we're going to be having our opening circle. We're going to do our land acknowledgement. We're going to be going through storytelling builds community, and Marcella is going to be leading that wonderful conversation. We'll have time for Q&A and some discussion. And I know I'm going a little bit fast. I just want to make sure we have as much time as possible to dig in on our topic. So we know that we are on occupied land. We acknowledge that we're on traditional territories and homelands of California Native people. And this includes 124 or more recognized tribes and many other who are not recognized. And all are very culturally diverse. We thank these nations for their generosity and keep them in our hearts and thoughts as we're in this space today, this week, and every day. I'm going to put a link in the chat so folks can introduce themselves as well as checking whose land it is that you're occupying. So if folks want to go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat, we'd love to know who's here. So your name, agency, and location. Let me get that chat in. Folks can also unmute if you want to introduce yourself. We'd love to hear your voices. If you'd rather do it in the chat, that is absolutely fine as well. That's wonderful. We have folks from all across the state, folks joining us who are not local, and that's awesome. All right, keep those introductions coming in. We have an excellent spread of folks for us today, Marcella. Right. Perfect. Keep those intros coming in. And with that, I am going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn it over to Marcella.
All right. Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm going to share my screen and PowerPoint up for everyone. All right, so thank you all so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. As a big kid at heart, stories have been extremely important to my life. And when this image was found, actually by Alejandra Aguilar, our prevention specialist, when this image was found, I felt like my inside kid just came out immediately. It just totally vibed with this. And I actually heard the theme song for Reading Rainbow in my head. And for those of you that don't know it, you know, it's that butterfly in the sky that can just go twice as high. It's looking for those adventures, it's wanting to connect with others and get outside of the world that they're living in. And for someone who was living in a home that did not feel safe at all, books and stories absolutely saved my life. They were the tools that kept me from going into spaces that I knew that I shouldn't be going into. And that space in particular, we will talk more about, because it's not a place that I physically go. It's a place that I consistently can go, and it's all optional, right? So first and foremost, with those of you in the room, I'm curious to find out, and you can say it out loud or you could put it in the chat, but I'm really curious to find out of those of you here who identifies as a storyteller, a story supporter, or both. So if you can just put that in, are you a storyteller, a story supporter, so someone who is in support of others sharing their stories, or are you both? Just really want to get a temperature for who else is in the room with me. All right, awesome. I like it. I like it. I've seen a lot of both. My people, I feel it and I appreciate it. And for those story supporters, we need you. Okay, we absolutely need you. Without your support, our stories are kept in silence. Silence, as we know, many times breeds that violence. And sadly, a lot of times that violence is only done to the self. So again, it may be silent to those out there, but it's starting in here. Those stories are starting here first. So really needing that support is imperative. And let me see if I can go to the next slide now. I don't know why this always happens with my shares. I might need you to, Miranda. I hope not, but we'll see. Okay. Oh, I went too far now. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay. So my storytelling goes back to my youth, very, very little. And the first person who really opened that up in me was my grandpa, Jack. And my grandpa was one of these individuals who didn't have a lot to say unless it was something that needed to be said, right? And so when he spoke, I really listened. I paid attention, especially because my grandpa was in what society would call back in those, in those days, very much so, a man's man, right? He was a railroad engineer for 44 years. He was gone, many times. And so when he was present, it was like a gift in itself. Tell me the stories, tell me about your adventures and such. So I remember very clearly when I was about 5 years old, and we were going for a walk, and he had asked me to tell him a story. And I thought, no, Grandpa, my stories are boring. All that came to my mind was, preschool, like what's going on? And what how is this comparable at all? And he told me there are no boring stories, only boring storytellers. And that stuck with me. It really stayed in the sense of all of us have a story that needs to be told, multiple stories. And yet, because of the fear in comparison and, comparing ourselves to other people, especially the trauma, comparison, then we don't think that our words are just, and we keep them to ourselves. And how that is unjust is all of the tools for resilience that so many times our stories possess. But because we don't share them, we keep them to ourselves, and we're actually keeping from the community. So I want people to be with that for a moment and think about the first person in your life that showed up and listened to your story. And if you can just put in the chat, how old were you? Think about that very first person that listened to your story, that took the time to get to know what you wanted to talk about. Not questions they already had ready, but a conversation they wanted to have started with you. How old are you? And you could just put the age in the chat or open the mic. And for some of us, we're still waiting, right? It could be very much that case, really wanting to have that trusted adult in our life. Okay, I'm seeing 8, 19, 17, another 8, 12. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the shares because I want you to really pay attention to the reason why that is of any kind of importance. And thinking about our favorite sociological model, right? So, what's the story? Why is it important that we're looking at this model? If we're starting with the story, it's starting with that individual, right? And it starts right here in how we formulate it, what it sounds like, and then it turns into what it feels like, and then what it becomes. And what it becomes is through our behaviors, whether they are reactions or responses, they are all showing up because of the story that we're telling ourselves. Now, that story could have gotten started at 8, at 19, or that story could have got started before we were even here, where it's generational. And that trauma is stored for generations in our family. And while our parents and their parents and their parents may have felt that they did better, and they probably did in many ways, the reality is that if that trauma was still happening, it's still being trickled down and passed down in our stories, especially. So thinking about the stories again, going back to Grandpa Jack, here I was thinking that my stories were boring. But the reality is that what I wasn't telling him was the stories that were really happening at home. He had no idea that his daughter-in-law, who he adored, absolutely adored, and would speak so highly about, was harming her children on the daily. He had no idea that his son completely neglected us, made no time for us, unless we were in his face, right? And then it's just usually noise. So Grandpa Jack didn't know those stories, and Grandpa Jack didn't ask me questions to get to those stories. Those are stories that I absolutely didn't feel comfortable talking to him about. I wanted it to be carefree and fun with Grandpa Jack. That's what he brought me. He got me out of the norm. He got me away from that home and that harm that was happening. So with him, I felt safe. He was my trusted adult, the very first person who showed up and wanted to listen to me just because I was me. But what about what was happening in my relationships at home that he wasn't hearing about? And how that then trickled into my community, because I absolutely had to go to school. And those behaviors 100% showed up. And then even going into societal, when I was looking for other stories, so I didn't have to settle with the stories at home. So think about being little and harm has happened. Where do you look for perspective? Outside in our world, in our society, where are some go-tos that especially children and or survivors of any age, where would they gravitate to? Peers, absolutely. Family, friends, yes. School leaders. And then think even wider, somebody that can't talk back to them, but they're talking constantly. What about that? Where are the stories in our society that we pull from, that we aim from, we dream from? Media, yes, Elise, absolutely, media big time, right? Remember, when I was little, all this harm is happening at home. I don't want to believe that that's the reality. So I tuned in other realities. And my favorites were, one of the shows was, for those of you 80s kids, Family Ties. And in Family Ties, there was the two parents totally in love with each other, the three children. And I absolutely was like, I want that. That's the home I deserve. And I intended it completely. The problem is that it wasn't coming to fruition by myself, right? It wasn't happening. So what happened when it was time for me to become a family of my own, which happened very quickly, I may say. So I became a mother at 19. And now this harm that's happening at home, the only trusted adult I had as a little passed on when I was just shy of 9 years old. So Grandpa Jack died at 9. And so from 9 until now, 19, becoming a mom, my only real role models were, as you had put in the chat, my peers, right? My friends, kind of my family, and my society. So all those stories were selling me ideas of what it could, should, and would be like if I could do something differently. But the only thing I knew how to do differently was not do what was happening at home, right? So let's talk about that. How can we really go outside that story and think about how to support the survivors that you are working with and or the youth, anyone who has that lived, real, learned experience, and thinking about now they're coming to you for that support and they say that they're ready to tell their story. Are they? Are they really ready? So I ask this with all good intentions because we want to believe survivors. We're told to believe survivors. And at our core, when they come to us with a story, we do believe they're ready. Because why would they tell us they are if they are not, right? But then the next question is really thinking about, will they be when it's time to actually share? So this happens a lot of times when somebody is absolutely gung-ho, they are ready to share their story, they know exactly why they want to tell it, and then the day comes and they freeze. They can't find the words. Or they start breaking down physically. They're crying. They're losing it, okay? This is not just I'm getting a little bit triggered by my own experience, but I am actually living my past experience right now in front of you, right? And how trauma-informed and survivor-centered are we being if we allow a person to put themselves in a place that they're already feeling unsafe, right? And then lastly, is it their story? This is so important to pay attention to, especially when we work in the gender-based violence field. We really are thinking about ways that we want to prevent gender-based violence. And so when we're putting on fundraisers and events and programs and thinking about what's going to pull in our community, what do they need to see here in order to connect? Oh, I know. We have this workshop where we talk about A, B, and C. If we can get the survivor to talk about this, then they would know it exists. But do they want to talk about that? Is it part of their story? Were they part of the development of that program? If not, why would we want to pull them in? Why would we want to have them tell our tale? So really centering on the survivor is finding out why they want to tell their story, how they want to tell their story, when and where, right? It's all got to be formulated from them. Otherwise, we've already taken over their story and it's no longer theirs. So the reason why I bring this up is because I had the privilege for the last 2.5 years to be on the partnership's Survivor Advisory Committee. And during that time, I learned that there is a survivor spectrum. This stuff is real, right? And so I'm going to go into what it is and what it isn't. But before I do, I want to give a little bit of a story to tell you all about how this came to be. So February of 2019, I was invited to join this, the Survivor Advisory Committee, and I was over the moon, absolutely over the moon, y'all, especially because I had already been in this field for about 7 years. And I had probably for the last 3 before that had been pleading with different agencies. My last one prior to the partnership, especially asking for a space for survivors to really share their stories, not a support group. I wanted a space where survivors could feel empowered and think about their stories from a preventative lens. I had had the incredible opportunity to work in prevention for 7 years up to this point. And I saw the intersections. I saw the ways that we could bring in our communities and we could inform them of other ways to have healthy relationships. I saw it, I lived it, I breathed it, and yet constantly I was being told from different agencies that there was no opportunity for this space because there was no money, right? And now we've all heard that before in this field of work in nonprofits. There's no money, there's no money, there's no money. And yet you want survivors to bring you money. Doesn't make sense, right? That's what we call exploiting the story. That's what we call using sensationalism in order to gather the story for our benefit. That's not being trauma-informed, and it's certainly not being survivor-centered because we're not looking at what they want. We're pulling them into our needs. And so when Jackie Mara Queen at the partnership had decided she wanted to put together the Survivor Advisory Committee, I was ecstatic, okay? I just knew that this is going to be a space where we were going to be able to leverage our stories and really find ways that we could either evaluate programs, inform policies, make change. And I wasn't the only one who thought this. So my fellow members on the committee during that time in early 2019 were just as jazzed as me. Every single one of us said the exact same thing. I want to tell my story. I'm ready to tell my story. I know people need to hear my story. And we were all absolutely convinced about this. And then as the time went on, we started to realize that our stories weren't done being told. And some of us didn't really feel comfortable telling them, whether it be telling them in public, whether that be telling them at all. And so early on, we ended up losing 2 committee members because of other responsibilities, other duties outside of the committee that just could not bring them into all the meetings where they needed to be. And so the 3 of us, the remaining of us, took it upon ourselves that we were going to do a survivors conference and bring in survivors in order to get their lived experience. We didn't want a conference about what we wanted. We wanted to find out what survivors wanted to talk about. What were their stories? What was their resilience? And how can we uplift their voices? So we started to think about the survivor experience, how some of us are similar and how many of us are very unique, not just necessarily in our individual stories, but in the ways that they ebb and flow. And so while I was listening to my the 2 members talk about their stories over the course of about 6 months, and we were starting to change here and there as well, because it's power dynamics, right? We are survivors, triggers happen. And there were times where we were even triggering one another or being triggered by outside sources, but it would impact our space. And so what I saw here was that it was a spectrum. We were all ebbing and flowing back and forth on this spectrum. And there was no shame in that. So what it is, I want us to really think about the spectrum is a journey, and it's all about getting from that trauma to resilience. When we know that the destination is resilience, it enables us to dig a little bit deeper in ways where we can be more empathetic with our own self, with our younger selves, with our harmed selves, in effort to really find out what those tools for resilience would be. So this conversation is especially important to have in our field, because not only are you all working with survivors and youth who may be survivors themselves, but sometimes not necessarily identify right away. 1 out of 2 people within our field identify as survivors. So in your office right now, 1 out of 2 people are a survivor, and they are living their stories on a daily. And those stories, without proper support, without tools for resilience, that trauma will find a way to trickle down. Whether it's a trigger here, a trigger there, not clear communication, egos flared up, right? It's all ways that that harmed self wants to be in control of the situation. So if we're not understanding of our own stories, 1, we won't be able to support others in telling theirs. And 2, we're only going to create more stories, right? So it's really important to be conscious and trauma informed about the work that we do. So what it is, it's feeling every feeling in every stage, not numbing it out, not cutting and running, right? We are feeling it. And so those waves that you saw earlier on that survivor spectrum, that's exactly how I see it. First, it's victim mentality. Those are the biggest waves. They are crashing. They are harmful. They are strong. They will push you over again and again, right? That victim mentality is very real. And so many of us live there for a while. So many of us don't even realize we're still living there. And yet, when we're triggered, we immediately react. We immediately tell ourselves our story. This always happens. See, I knew that they didn't really, that they always were. It's that story over and over, individually. And then it's going to trickle over into our relationships, into our community, and into our society. So victim mentality, there's no shame in being in this phase. It is a trauma response. It is the first one that we will all identify with. And because our society tells us that it is the weakest link, it is the ugliest place to be, we do everything we can in order to get out of it, even if it's fake, the funk. And many of us do that. We pretend we're not victims, and we get into situations where then we're victim blaming and shaming all over again, pointing fingers and immediately getting triggered instead of truly doing that work. And so the next one is the survivor mode. So survivor mode is an interesting space to be because, quite frankly, our society absolutely supports survivor mode. It sings songs about it, right? I'm a survivor. We have so many stories in our atmosphere that tell us that there is celebration in being a survivor. And there is. There absolutely is celebration. And there's also repetition. And that's what turns out into the survivor mode, is that here we are convincing ourselves on the daily, but I'm over it, but I got through it. I'm good. It could be worse. It's not that bad, right? We start listening to our survivor stories. We start listening to our client stories, and we start comparing. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. I mean, I'm barely making money, but hey, the reward is in the work. Survivor mode. We are convincing ourselves in order to remain in a space that really doesn't feel safe, but it's familiar. And it's better than where we were. So we're going to stick it out and stay here. But there's so much more. And so this is where I encourage people to truly thrive from trauma. What is that looking like? Right here, right now. This, we're connecting, we're sharing a topic that's important to all of us. We're listening, we're learning, we're finding ways to use our trauma for resilience. We're pulling back that layer and seeing that it doesn't have to be this way. It's all a choice, right? And so we could use our trauma to either speak out loud and share that story, or we can share them quietly, individually, when we're supporting survivors and youth and those with lived experiences when they're ready to share their story. Because when you know that another has a similar experience, it's so much more empowering. And also, it makes you feel that much more eager to share because you know you're not alone. Others really have to hear this now. And so this is where the survivor spectrum really makes sense for me and hones in, because it is about identifying the patterns, right? We see the patterns in the story. We're not just going to limit ourselves to victim mentality. And yet, if and when we are triggered and we find ourselves unable to get up in the morning, unable to do the dishes for a couple of days, we will not beat ourselves up. Victim mentality is real. There is no reason to continue to harm the self in telling the self that they're doing anything wrong. What they're doing is what they know. So it's about living, looking, and listening in order to do a little bit better, right? So this is when we're really being mindful of those celebratory moments, of the repetitive moments, and we're thinking about how can we pay attention to other people's survivor spectrum, because we're all ebbing and flowing simultaneously. And if I'm over here and thriving, right, and I'm feeling myself, I'm sharing my skills, I'm feeling really good. Now I have a survivor who is just deep, dark in that victim mentality. Do they want to hear it? Am I benefiting them? Or is it a lecture, right? So it's really about pulling in that empathy, flexing that muscle, remembering that lived experience that you also had, and having the opportunity to share that conversation with them so they know that we're just ebbing and flowing, right? So what it is not a life sentence, right? This is about recognizing those triggers and responding differently. It doesn't have to be just immediately mad. I was mad for a long time. You can see it when I'm not smiling. I look like I'm pissed off constantly, right? It's not a good look. And it's a look that's real because I was mad. I had every right to be mad because I was hurt. I was lied to. I was left alone, and I didn't have the support that I needed. So what that does is it creates people who no longer trust others. So now here you are. You want me to trust you because you're doing work with survivors. But how can I trust when I've just constantly been told that what I have to say is not ready to be heard, right? So really thinking about the spectrum of it's not therapy, right? I'm not by any means saying that we have all become, counselors and we're ready, to speak on these facts. This is about recognizing that ebb and flow, making sure that they're getting the support that they need outside of you as well, thinking about the overall community. And like I said, just not shaming the survivor's experience, right? We all have guilt. Guilt is huge. The moment we ebb and flow backwards, we immediately beat ourselves up. I can't believe you're here again. I thought you learned this lesson. Didn't we already do this? How long did it take to get there? Not just with you. It's generational. It's learned, right? And so it's really about giving ourselves grace in any space that we're in, understanding that we're ebbing and flowing to the best of our ability. So the survivor spectrum is really just all about those trauma responses, paying attention to the different ways that your clients are talking about their story, right? So pay attention. When they say, I'm ready, tell me more. What would you talk about, right? And then pay attention to the ebb and flow. Are there times where they are shutting down? I don't want to talk about this part. Okay, duly noted. Are they breaking down? Well, maybe they're not ready to talk about this part. Let's give a little bit more support. But no matter how they're showing up and telling their story, there's no shame. And it's not up to us to say, you're not ready. It's up to us to ask, are you ready? I'm noticing this. I'm hearing this. I'm seeing this, right? Supporting our storytellers. So one of the ways that we can support storytellers is through story circles. I absolutely love story circles. I have created many of these communities over the last 2 years because of my experience in the Survivor Advisory Committee. And I am very proud to say that one of the story circles I am in, we are currently working in effort to create an anthology. And we're going to open it up to others who have lived experiences like ours. And we are called FACES with a small f, in order to really bring attention and awareness to the faces of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, that is something that is absolutely vital to me. It is my mission in life, in order to create spaces where survivors and youth feel safe and seen and heard by being a trusted adult. And so I talk to different people throughout the community and how we can show up as trusted adults. And one of the ways that I do that is through the story circle. So the story circle is an excellent way to get to know who's in your community. And the story circles can start by just the community alone, right? You can go into an actual community and start a story circle. Who wants to share stories about this city, right? This community. Only center the stories on that. Because as you will see at the very last one, not a support group. This is so vital to talk about. I cannot stress this enough. If you are not intentional about your space from the beginning and letting it be known that the stories, while they are theirs and 100% their lived experiences, and it will be formulated by them, we have to stay on topic because it will easily turn into a support group. And while this group is there to support the person, they're there to support their story, not any problems that are coming up along the way. It doesn't mean that they don't build connections with people and they can't have those conversations outside of that space. That happens all the time and it's beautiful. However, in order to really, truly be survivor focused and trauma informed, we need to remember that the other people in there are going to be triggered by these current stories, these current problems. This is not the space for that. This is a space to create the community where you're going to be sharing your stories about the community, right? And so why this is so important to do in a circle setting is because now we all see each other. I see you here, I see you here, I see you here. We're all together. And it has been proven that sharing a circle space makes you feel an expansion, and you can literally feel it in your body, and you feel empowered to then start sharing your story. So in these spaces, you will often hear, me too, because it is the first time, many times, that they're having the opportunity to talk about those stories. So it's such a vital time to pay attention to who's in the community. What strengths are they bringing to this community? And what are their stories really? You know, I am bringing back to, I'm reminded of a story circle I was in where initially the story circle was about our community and talking about the reasons why we don't have parks, right? Green spaces. And it was really interesting because when we really started to center on our city and we talked just about those spaces, we learned that here we are in this city that's basically a concrete jungle. And yet, because we started to share, Somebody told us about this free space that that's open for children up to 12 years old, that they have this membership. It's like a children's museum. Like there's all these different opportunities that had we not focused on this topic, we wouldn't have learned about all these resources within our own space. So really being centered on the topic allows you to expand on that topic in ways that create a safer feeling in the community. Another way that I have shared, and I've been very proud of this work, is through the interactive story platform that we have at the partnership. Now, so far, we've had the opportunity to share 2 stories, and both of these stories have an opportunity for you as the reader/viewer to be a part of the story. So not only are you meeting Monica and Anna, but you have the opportunity to help them, to support them. And what does that look like? How will you show up? So the reason why this is so important, and I share it here, is because these are not just stories that I made up. These are stories that were contributed by incredible storytellers in our communities. So throughout California, I had the opportunity to interview different people with lived experiences for both of these stories. So for the first one, Monica Matters, I had the opportunity of interviewing survivors who were dealing with the impact of COVID and having to be at home with an infant and what that was looking like without having proper support, not just financially, but even with their relationship. And Lupe enters the scene, meets Monica, and has to make a decision of how to have this conversation. What does Monica need? So the beautiful thing is that Monica was made up of 3 different people. And every single one of those people shared their raw, real experience with me because I invited them into a space to feel seen and heard. There was no judgment. There's no direction. There's no interruption. I'm not there with an array of questions. I'm there for them to tell me what we need to know. And that's exactly what they did. And I will tell you this, along the way, when we were starting to review the stories and we brought advisors in to tell us if the story felt realistic, authentic, resourceful, we had a whole room of people that were quite bothered by what they saw in Monica Matters. And they were saying it was stereotypical, and they thought it would have a bad light on the people in the story. And they really were bothered by this. And so I went back to the survivors who told me the stories, and I asked them, like, do you want to change this? Should we pull this out? Well, how do you feel about this? It is your story. I want to honor it. Every single one, it stays in. That's what happened. That's why I'm here. And that's what they need to know. And so if you are bothered by that story, ask yourself why. Because these are the conversations we're not having that need to be had. Monica matters. And that's why her story stuck. And as far as Anna was an array of 5 different youth and 4 teachers. And then we had advisors of a total of 7 youth. And oh my gosh, amazing, amazing. Working with people who've lived it, learned it, makes my job so much easier. I don't know, right? I think I know, but I don't know what I don't know. And when they do, and they tell me, I have an opportunity to then ebb it and flow it into a story that is going to feel like it's only one character, but it's actually an array of multiple characters, because we are an array of multiple characters. We've had so many lived experiences. Our stories intersect all the time. So it was important for us to be intentional about these stories and doing the same thing. And so because both of these stories were very involved, and for those of you who have read them, you will know, I believe the total was 45 scenes, which is a lot for those of you who are storytellers and know, like, here I am, I have to make this a choose your adventure type of story. And I have to give you options. And now if you choose this one, that whole story changes. So at one point I had 45 scenes, and it was a lot of feedback, a lot of, edits, and a lot of money. So what we learned from that experience was you can actually say a lot with less. So our next story coming up is only going to be 10 scenes. And I'm so excited about it because while it might feel really raw, that's what I wanted to feel. I want to pull you in because I only have 10 scenes and I have to pull you in fast in order for you to make a decision. So this is going to come at you pretty heavy, but everything is solution based. So again, this next story, which is about Native youth, young men in particular, I had an opportunity to speak to 4 different young men, and also to a Native mother, 2 Native mothers, as well as 2 people in the health field. And I'm super excited about this next story because I feel that it enables us to give a big voice to something that we don't hear enough about. And again, this has everything to do with showing up as a trusted adult, just letting the sage be the stage. I don't set anything, it's just open. They come on in and they set the spotlight. They tell me where they want to go, what direction. And then we come back again and I invite them to tell me, is it working? Is it meeting your needs? What are we missing? And it's been a completely beautiful process. It's one that I absolutely encourage people in our community to start doing. If you're going to do storytelling, bring in your community. It's all about their stories anyway, right? So bring in your community members to find out what they want to talk about. And that's when you're going to be finding all the resources for them as well. And one of my favorite collaborations is with youth. I know I'm biased. It's my inside kid. My inside kid absolutely loves to come out, and she is totally jazzed whenever she gets to come out and hang out with youth. So I had the incredible opportunity this past January through February to write stories with 10 youth through the collaboration of the Partnerships Communications team and Story Center. And for those of you who are not familiar with Story Center, we will be sharing links. I highly encourage working with them. We are going to be inviting them back again to work with survivors next year in order to tell their stories. But the beautiful thing about Story Center is that they help you tell your story in a completely unique way. So now here we are sharing our stories and we're putting them into visual narratives, right? It's a digital story and it becomes real. We're really living this experience because we're seeing pictures, we're hearing the speaker's words. It brings you to a whole nother level of connection with that person who's lived the experience. So I highly recommend it. But besides the actual story itself, the opportunity to be the trusted adult in the room and work with the youth was one that I will not soon forget. I have made connections with some of these youth, and a few of them we were just so impressed by that I actually had invited them to speak with legislators during Orange Day because they were just phenomenal. They had their points, they had their story, they had those tools for resilience. But here's the thing, they didn't know they did. They had no idea that they knew any of these things until they started to pull back and look at their story. So what I really appreciated about Story Center's, their technique was that our stories are big, right? They're huge, they're so big. And we could be here all day if we just say, tell me a story, tell me about you. They honed it in and they had us talk about one moment in time, just one moment. And then to do 3-minute reel on that moment. And it was so incredible to see the array of stories and resources and just resilience that came out of this. Because our topic was, what was the moment that you knew that you were an activist, that you were in this movement, right? You wanted to be an activist. And I'll tell you all what, it absolutely restored my faith in humanity. These youth were incredible. We will also be sharing the link to the page on our site so you can see their stories. I encourage you to as well. They were very hard hitting, and at the same time, because of the support that we gave each other, it was like it was a safe space for all of them. It was easier for them to tell their stories. And I know I'm speaking for them right now, and I wish that they were here in order to speak for themselves, which is why I highly encourage you to watch their videos in order to see for yourself how phenomenal they are, and why it's important to make sure that it's their story, not what we want to aim for, but really thinking about what do they want to talk about. Because here's the beautiful thing. 9 times out of 10, it's already in alignment with what you have. It's just a matter of listening in order for them to see their own preventative skills, right? We all have prevention and advocacy skills. We just don't know it. But when we start to pull back the story, we can see those strings. So again, going back to the story, is it theirs? How can we make sure it is? How do we keep it theirs in order to make sure that when it goes into the relationship, it's still theirs? And so what I'm talking about with this is even thinking about when we do our workshops and we're talking about healthy relationships, there were so many times that I would be in those spaces and I would have eyes pop open like, wow, I never thought about it like that. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, I like that. I like that. And then, you all know what I mean when I say that over time, whether you have a few hours with the population, whether you have a few weeks, over time, their stances start to be more like, right? You're pulling them in. They want it. They're bought. And now what happens when they go into the community, right? Do they know how to sell it? What are they selling? So again, this is why it's so important to be a story supporter, helping them hear their stories, helping them learn that the survivor spectrum is no wave of shame. There's no reason to be guilt trip over that, right? Helping them understand that they have the authority to ask for money, more time. They have the opportunity to ask for their stories to be told their way. And I am really excited that our communications team here at the partnership has been listening to me gripe so much over the last few years that they are bringing in a media advocacy training specifically for survivors because survivor stories are always told under a different lens when they don't know that that their stories belong to them. Because what happens so many times is a survivor immediately is like, oh my gosh, I want to tell my story. I want to tell my story. I'm ready, right? I'm ready. And then here goes the interview. And the interview asks A, B, and C. Ooh, well, I really don't want to answer B. I don't like B. B is not a good question at all, but I'm going to answer it because they're asking. And if I don't answer it, I might not get an opportunity like this again. And my story is really important. So I have to ask it, even though it hurts me to answer it. So again, if we don't speak up and out, people can't hear what we need. I kept telling communications, we need better communications. We need better interviews. They listened, they're creating it. They're bringing in Rally, right? This is incredible news. So that individual story took it to the relationship that is now taken into the community. And you best believe those reporters that we were working with are going to take it to societal, right? So it all begins with the story you're telling yourself. Oh, they don't care. It doesn't matter. It's not important. They don't want to know. We have to know to grow. We have to. So now I'm going to open it up to all of you for any questions and also for story topics, because here's a big old plug. I'm writing stories, and I am currently writing the story for July. However, and while the graphic designers are working on the story that I just submitted for June. So I'm looking for August. I'm looking for September, October, November. Let's go. Let's bring it. What is your community talking about? What are you talking about? What's going on? I want to know all about it. And I invite you to share those topics with me, because the beautiful thing is that I can pay you. So at the partnership, we have the opportunity to provide our contributors with speaker's fee. And as a speaker and contributing to the story, you will meet with me at least 3 times, where you will develop the story, you will come back for feedback on the story, and then you will also help develop the companion guide, which goes along with the story. And for those 3 meetings, we will meet anywhere from a half an hour to an hour. And after the 3rd meeting, you will receive $150. So like I said, we know that your emotional labor, we know that your stories are worth the time spent, and I want to be able to honor your time and hearing them. So what's up there, what's out there, please let me know. And with that being said, I'm going to open it up to questions and just find out what you guys all want to talk about. No reason to be shy. I am open to any question. I do have boundaries, so if it's too deep here, I will I'll be more than happy to meet in a different space with you for a different time. But otherwise, I'm an open book. And if there are no questions, what I will do right now, just so you all will have an idea, I am going to share the story that I created with Story Center. And the reason why I'm sharing this story is because I feel that it is valid in our topic, in storytelling builds community. So let me pull this up. form together in a circle. Their uniforms were clear of where I was. Each step happened instead of peace. They still. One claimed he wasn't a good reader and tried to hand the paper back. I'll read, you follow, I said as his eyes rolled. From day one, I was told I wasn't like them. Okay, someone just said the sound is low. I know that there was a way to make it higher. I'm trying to figure that out.
Oh, it sounded okay just now.
Oh, it did? It was okay now? Okay, perfect. From day one, I was told I wasn't like them. They're boys, my boss said. They're criminals, probation officers warned. Watch your back and never share anything personal. I didn't trust men before I met them. I was there to teach prevention education, not get close. I listened to the rules until I didn't. Before reading, I asked the guys to underline behaviors they thought were unhealthy and to circle anything healthy. Pencils moved as I read about a young woman's experience with intoxication, infidelity, and trying to find a father for her illegitimate child. After the last word was read, there started. I can't believe she did that. She's messed up. I smiled, then took a deep breath. That was me. Their moods changed as fast as their words. Say what? I didn't mean it. Didn't you? I asked. Let's talk about why it makes a difference that it was me. I shared how I was treated for wanting sex, then not wanting it, and asked what happens to girls who sleep around and get knocked up. Nobody wants them, one yelled. Like you, another shouted at him. They all laughed until they caught me watching, silently. I'm sorry, he said. You're more like us than I thought. I left the detention center with hope in my heart. For the first time, a group of guys saw me and heard me as me. Despite my past, I am now an advocate and author who supports others, especially youth, the way I dared to share my story, because I refused to be written off. Thank you all for that. I just wanted to share it because, as you heard, that story was really about the youth that I was working with at one time. And again, the stories that were told, the stories that were told to me, that I couldn't talk about my stuff. It had to be centered on them. And a part of being survivor-centered and trauma-informed is knowing that we can see each other. We can share these stories in effort to connect. It was the first time that they had an opportunity to know that I'm not just someone else, right? I've been there, I've done that. And again, in this field of 1 out of 2 of us are survivors, it's imperative that we share our story. That is liberation. This is empowering. This is thriving from trauma, is when we can say, I lived it, I learned it, so you don't have to. And that's why we get to talk about this, right? So really lean in to your survivorship as a storyteller. You have every right to speak on things that you are an expert on, right? So again, it's not about taking over the conversation. Absolutely not. It's not like I went into those spaces and next thing you know, it was just talking about me. No. But if I heard something and I was like, they're judging me right now, right? But they don't know they're judging me. They don't know they're judging their mom. They don't know that they're judging their cousin. They don't know that they're judging their future, spouse. We're judging constantly because we're not connecting on deeper levels. And when we're able to really listen to the stories and why they're so important to tell, that's when we're able to really build that community. And I emphasize unity because unity in the community is all about communion. It's all about conversation. When I commune with you, I learn about you. That then unifies me to you. I know something about you now. This is how we gain strength because we know we're not alone and we know who we could lean on now, right? So for those out there, I'm curious to know, what tools are you ready to use now, or what do you want to learn more about? So we have those story circles. We have creating your own stories with Story Center. We have creating interactive stories digitally. There's so many ways to tell the story. So what are you encouraged to do next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Brenda. And oh my gosh, I love everything you've been talking about. It's just so inspiring. And one of the things that I kind of have a question is, so at my agency, I could totally relate with, I'm the one that kind of collects stories for our either publications, or I find survivors that feel ready to tell their story at a presentation or etc. And so like when I heard you talk about that portion, I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way. And so how can I start implementing story circles at my agency? Because I know money is always an issue, and I've brought up wanting to get training at Story Center, but is there another way that I can, I guess, implement those things?
I love that question.
Thank you.
I invite anybody else first, if anybody else is doing something similar with the funds that we have. And then if nobody else has anything, then I will feel free to share. I'm not surprised by silence because sadly, it is usually a money issue, right? Okay, that's a great question, Brenda, and I appreciate you being the one to bring the stories in. It's incredible work. It's such incredible work to do. With that, I will say that one way is, since we are virtual, which is wonderful, right? And so many of us have that the need, already have the subscription to our platforms. This is a great way to start a story circle online, especially with survivors, because with survivors, many times it could be a transportation issue, it could be a childcare issue. There's so many other factors that come in, and most importantly, it could be a fear of telling it in front of everybody else, at least initially. So what I have seen in the story circles online, it's such a wonderful way to invite people in who may themselves be on the fence of, am I ready? Am I ready to tell my story? So I really invite you to create that space. And if you are working with survivors, be mindful of the times. So here at the partnership, when we were working with survivors, especially in the committee, we wanted to be intentional about doing it on the weekends or evening hours. Now I know that cuts into our hours as employees a lot of times, but this is where you can justify that this is still outreach, right? You are still, doing that job. And so maybe carving out that hour and being able to service it later in the evening or on the weekend to create that safe space for the survivors to share.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I didn't even think of that.
You're very welcome.
Another question, if nobody else has a question, should there be like certain story or like writing prompts or any like, you know, prompts that I should be thinking about?
That's a wonderful question. I appreciate that so much. Yes. So writing prompts, for those of you who are not familiar, are such a great way to get people into the room and into their room, right? How far do they want to go type of a thing. So again, it's all about knowing your audience. So sometimes we go in with a set of questions and then we go into the room and we're like, oh, nope, these questions are not going to work. I totally trust that those of you who are, you know, advocates and preventionists, you know how to change on the fly. However, one of the very first questions that I like to pay attention to when working with a new survivor or youth is first and foremost to go in and ask them, what's the first story you remember telling? Right. So you can invite them in just for themselves, right? What is the first story you remember telling? And usually it's something in childhood, but they'll start searching. And again, this is your opportunity to start to pay attention to that survivor spectrum. How are they ebbing and flowing? Did they immediately shut down? Because now you know that that's not a safe space. Their childhood is not a safe space, or whatever time that they started to wasn't safe. So what that means is that it could be that the first time they told someone, they were shut down. They were told that they were a liar. So that's another good indicator of asking that question, right? So you could have a follow-up question of, what is the first story you remember sharing? Watch their ebb and flow, and then going into, did you feel seen? Did you feel safe sharing your story? Did you feel supported in sharing your story, right? So this also allows you to build that connection with that person, and they know that that's your intention. You want them to feel safe, seen, and supported. If they weren't before, how can they be now, right? And so that's a really beautiful way to also get them into their own room, if you will, to know that whatever I share here is mine, and it's going to only be mine, no matter what, right? So that's another thing that's important, is to set those guidelines in the very beginning, letting them know that as the story supporter, you are there to find out what is their story, why do they want to tell it, how do they want to tell it? Because so many times we have this assumption that they want to tell it out loud. No, maybe they just want to do a soundbite for your marketing, right? So really finding out, how do they want to tell it? What do they want to tell? Many times they don't even know. They think they know, but this is where your support comes in. And then lastly, how often do they want to tell it? So storytelling is a muscle. We start flexing it. We want to start doing more of it. So also paying attention to that, you will have some survivors you'll never hear from again. They won't even tell the story. They won't even finish telling the story. They'll get to a point where they know they're not ready. And then you'll have other ones that right after they told the first time, they're ready to come back and tell another one, right? So really paying attention to where they are on the ebb and flow. I appreciate y'all so much. If there are no other questions, I'd really invite you all to start thinking about your own story as the storyteller, especially. And how are you showing up for yourself? How are you a trusted adult to yourself first and foremost? Is your story safe? Or is there any part of it that you still feel is being denied? Because that's the part you want to lean into. And when you start to do the work on your own story, you start to understand how you can support other people in sharing theirs. You know what they need to lean into. You know what they want to get away from, right? And because we want our survivors and our youth to feel safe in sharing their stories, this is why it's so important to really model that first and foremost, and start centering your own story and being trauma informed about yours, right? Because I'm such an expressive person, when I first started doing this work, and I'm telling you this because I'm not proud of it. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to make the same mistake. Here I thought that it's just being empathetic, right? But I was actually like scaring people because I'm sitting there listening to their story. And as they would tell certain things, I'd be like, oh my gosh, really? Oh, no, right? If I'm surprised, if I'm just as surprised, then they might have a reaction of, ooh, maybe that was too much. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe my story is too scary, you know? So really being mindful of the way that you show up as well. And I'm not gonna lie, this is hard. This is a hard one if you're anything like me in, you know, just being an expressive person. So what I do now, in order to just really focus and center on them and not overreact, is I just watch their mouth. Because it tells my brain to focus instead of react, right? So just whatever works for you, that definitely works for me. Focusing on something and really being with their story instead of starting to create one, because that's what happens. That's what the reaction is. The reaction is you creating a story on their story. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to them. That would have never happened to me. I would have never done that, right? You're lost already. You're gone. You're not in it anymore. So focus on them and then you stay with them. Yes, Kathy, please, question.
Hi, yes, I do have a question. Number one, thank you, Marcella, just for leading this. And similar to Brenda, I believe, I've enjoyed this whole conversation. And I'm transitioning into this field, so I am still, learning a lot. But just going off of your last point too, I actually had a peer of mine, a colleague of mine, who she heard about what I'm, trying to go into this field. And she really opened up and she shared with me her story. And I know you had mentioned earlier how a lot of survivors, they don't like to think about it or talk about the ebb and flow, and they avoid it. And so I'm just curious, what suggestions that you have where, I could support others in feeling those feelings like you had talked about, when I am noticing, those around me who are more victim mentality or survivor mode. How would you suggest just like supporting others to really feel those feelings and to create that, safe, supported and seen environment that you were mentioning earlier?
I appreciate that, Kathy. I really appreciate you bringing this up as well, because you're absolutely right. And this is what so many of us in this work find very quickly is the disclosures, right? People feel safe knowing that you do this work. So automatically it's, I get to disclose, I get to unload on you. But there are times where it can't feel just like that. It could feel like it's a load and it's more work. And it's not necessarily work that is wanted, right? So it's not necessarily they even want you to help them, but knowing that you do this, it's just like this automatic, I feel safe in telling you. So with that, I will say this. It's really about having those boundaries, right? And again, with that modeling and mentoring those boundaries, letting your friends, colleagues, those that you are sharing your work with, know that if they want to share their own stories, you are more than happy to invite them in. How would I say, like, you are happy to invite them in to share, but with an understanding that there will be no direction given unless it's asked of. And so this is really important because it's really about having them hear their own words. So many times we are so stuck in our own story that we haven't even listened to it. We're just stuck on it. It is it. We are convinced of it. It is it. And then we tell someone else. And as we're telling someone else, we start to find the holes in our own story. So this is another thing I invite you to do with people is if they say, I just want to share. I just want somebody to hear me and talk. Okay. As you share, can I invite you to also listen to yourself? Please listen to your own words as we talk together. I want you to hear yourself. It may be the first time you do, right? So invite them in. It's a conversation with themselves as much as it is with you. And so many times they find the resources in their own story.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Best of luck to you. I'm so glad you're here. I admire everybody who has the strength to hold stories because it's heavy work. It really is. And with that, I will say that you're not alone. There are so many resources out here. First and foremost, know your audience. That's so big. Know your audience, and not just as a storyteller and making sure that the people who are in the room are ready to hear the message attached to a call of action, right? Because otherwise it's just a story. We didn't build community. We just share. If we want to build community, we want to take that individual, we want it to go all the way societal, that message has to have a call of action. The call of action is only going to be found through the storytelling itself. Where did you get stuck? Is it the victim mentality? Is it a survivor mode? Where are we not ebbing and flowing, right? What resources did we not have? So that's another reason why it's so important to know your own story. Brenda, do you know of any story circles? Actually, I had one up this morning, so I will make sure that I include it in the follow-up email because I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but they have an incredible story circle. So I will share that information with y'all in follow-up. And story circles are actually not too hard to create. It's just a matter of being intentional and having somebody there who can hold that space clearly, like just know their role, and they stay in it. They don't taper in and out of it, and then that way everybody already knows right away. This is not a support group. This is a space where we're sharing. I thank you all so much. I know these are dark, heavy stories, and that's why we have to lighten them up with our brilliance, our generational resilience. Remember, just like my grandpa said, there are no boring stories. So liven up those stories. Let them be known loud and proud. You have something to say. You lived it. You learned it. Let's hear it, right? Thank you all so much. I appreciate you all. And we will be sure to get you all of these good links afterwards. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to contact me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I am more than happy to be of service because I love the stories. Bring them, bring them.
Thank you so much, Marcella. That was wonderful.